normal, so we'll see how that goes. So I'm really glad to be here with you tonight. As Phil said, I'm Michelle Scott Huffman. I'm an ordained disciples minister, so Ecclesia Progressive Campus Ministry. Ecclesia you might know as United Ministries in Higher Education. So we're that progressive ecumenical campus ministry that's been doing what we're doing for going on close to 60 years. And we are the only progressive campus ministry voice at Missouri State. So all the prayer support and love that you can send our way, we really appreciate. So I started in this position in January of this year, and I was working with Howard Kavner, who just retired from this position in July. And one of the great things was, in that transition time, I was sort of looking forward, and he was looking back, and he was finalizing some grant reports, and I was planning for the future. And there was a point in time in the early spring where Lisa brought the mail in, and she laid down on my desk the Westminster John Knox Press catalog, and I opened the first page, and Austen's book, Transforming, was right there, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to get him. He needs to come here. And so I reached out to Austen, and Austen was extremely gracious and willing to come and not just do a keynote, but do some crazy workshops that I had him like make up that he had never done before, and all of this good stuff. So I'm just super excited to have Austen here. I want to welcome you and thank you for being here. I also want to tell you that if you know other folks who aren't here tonight, that Austen will be speaking on campus tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in the Davis Harrington Welcome Center. The great thing about that location is that right across the street, right next to the Monroe apartment building, there's a parking lot where you can park for free after 5 p.m., and there's almost always parking spots available there. So send people there. We'd love to see them tomorrow night at 7. So, Austen Hartke, I did not know before I opened the Westminster John Knox Press catalog and saw that great book. But I was really super excited, not just by the fact that it's a really attractive book, the cover is great, but also with the content, because I think it's so needed in our church conversations right now, in our societal conversations. So Austen is a multifaceted guy, a graduate of Luther Seminary, a Hebrew Bible scholar, and is the personality of the YouTube page Transgender and Christian. Has quite a following there, and as I said, really importantly, the author of a book that's published not by some self-publishing or some sort of sketchy, questionable, but by a really reputable publishing house that takes theology seriously, that takes academia seriously, and so I found this to be a really important resource for us as the church. So I want to welcome Austen. What he's got to share is far more important than anything I have to say. But I do want to say thank you, and please stay connected. I do have information on our ministry here, so if you want to take some of that with you when you go, I've got it. So welcome, Austen, and thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's see how we're doing with sound. I don't know. How's it sound, everybody?
Good.
Okay.
Fabulous.
Cool. All right. So I want to also invite you, if you are going to have a hard time reading some smaller print, definitely move up because there's going to be some smaller print. And I'll try to make that as accessible to everybody as I can, but it might be a little hard to read. So my name is Austen Hartke, and I just had a wonderful introduction there from Michelle. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and my story, and then we're going to do a little bit of allyship work and learning how to we're going to learn a little bit about gender identity, and then we're going to learn about how to support LGBTQ plus folks and what that acronym means, if you didn't catch that. So I grew up in Minnesota, that's where I'm from, and I grew up in evangelical churches until I was about 10 years old. So that was sort of my first background, and my first language was sort of the language of evangelical ministry. And when I was like 10 or 11, my parents split up, and my dad started going to a Lutheran church that was, if you're familiar with the Lutheran church at all, is the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And they're not very LGBT affirming. And so that was my second church experience, was this church that was didn't want women in ministry and was not very LGBT affirming, and that was sort of my second experience. My third experience was when I was about 14. I was in high school, and I was assigned female at birth, so everybody thought I was a girl, and I got to tell them they were wrong later. But I looked like a girl to everybody that could kind of look at me. I was kind of a tomboy, but most people were like, whatever, it's fine. And when I was 14, I fell in love with my best friend, who was a girl. So like you do, falling in love with your best friend as a teenager. And she was affiliated with, she'd grown up in an evangelical Lutheran church, an ELCA Lutheran church, and she said, you gotta come with me to church. And I, at first, was like, I know how this evangelical thing works. I know what you're trying to get me into. But she was like, no, you gotta come sing in our choir. And I loved choir, it was my favorite thing. And all I wanted to do was sing in like any choir that would have me. So I go to choir, and I started getting involved with this church community because I had to like come sing on Sundays. The Wednesday night practice was fine, but then I had to come sing on Sundays when there was actual church going on. And I found this community that just like wrapped me up, just like totally loved me. And it was like in the process of coming out as bisexual during that period and like having that community support me that I had my first like positive experience with faith and with church community. And I wouldn't have had that. And like that church, they were not and still aren't officially LGBT welcoming. Like they didn't know that much. They weren't super educated on it. They just knew me, and they were really kind to me in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And so that was kind of the starting point of me thinking like, this Christianity thing, maybe it's not so bad after all. So flash forward, well actually no, I'll tell you one more thing about my teenagerhood in that church. At that time, everybody in my year was going through confirmation. So like 14, 15 years old, you go through confirmation in the Lutheran church, which was confirming the things that people had promised for you at your baptism when you were a baby. Being raised in the evangelical church, I had never been baptized as a baby. So I get to the Lutheran church, and I start kind of going through the confirmation thing with everybody my age. And at one point they're like, and at least, we're all baptized here and yada yada. And I was like, I'm not. No, not me. Where was I? I was out, playing in the yard, I guess, and everybody got baptized without me. But they kind of took that in stride and said like, oh, okay, don't worry about it, it's gonna be fine. Let's talk about like what baptism actually means. And so we kind of, through my experience of not knowing the background, the whole group of youth ended up going through, I'm sure I made work for other people, but we all ended up going through this thing about like what is baptism and why do we believe that we do it for babies and not for adults like other people do. And it was really interesting. And I came to this place where I thought, like, having had a negative experience with church and with faith as a younger kid, and then in my early teenage years, I kind of thought, maybe Christianity isn't for me, but I still had this evangelical background that told me, like, there's one right way out there, so I just have to find which one way is the right way. So I started doing all this investigation into, like, all the religions of the world, and I was like, one of these has got to be right. I just have to figure out which one it is. And this was all happening at the same time as confirmation, so I was kind of getting this theological education that I wasn't expecting. And one of the things that really tripped me up, and that I felt like was the most difficult thing to deal with, was this sense that I had to believe every single thing that the rest of the church believed. Like I had to believe 100% of the creeds, I had to believe in like everything Luther ever wrote. Like I felt this huge pressure to believe all these things that everybody else believed, or at least said they did, right? I didn't know. And so I ended up having a lot of talks with my pastor, and he was really kind. He kind of let me in to just sort of talk and spout out whatever worries I had and talk about it. Eventually, he said, you know what, you don't have to believe every single thing about this, because faith is like one of those big parachutes that you play with in kindergarten, where everybody's like holding a bit of the parachute and you have something in the middle that you like fling up and down. He says faith is like that. Everybody has an edge of the parachute, and we're all holding our little bit. And there are going to be some days when you're going to have to like let go of a little bit because it's just not right anymore. And somebody next to you is going to like pull in another hand and take a hold of that, and they're going to hold that bit for you. And then other times you're going to hold a little bit for them. So you don't have to believe every single thing. It's okay. And that was like a real load off my mind. But I still was not sure if I wanted to get baptized, because I was still not sure if I wanted to be involved in a church that didn't fully affirm me as a bisexual person, as I was sort of coming to know myself to be. And so I kind of pressed pause on everything faith-related. I was like, this is gonna have to wait, I have to go to college, I'll figure it out later. While I was in college, it just wouldn't go away. It kept sort of nagging at me. A lot of the time when I talk about my experiences with faith, and especially as somebody who is bisexual and transgender, people ask me, like, why are you still here? Why are you still here in a lot of communities that don't want you to be there? And I always say that my experience with God is like, if you ever read the kid's book, The Runaway Bunny, there's this little baby bunny who's like gonna run away, and his mom is always like, well, if you become a flower, I'm gonna become a gardener. If you become a boat, I will become the sea. You know, like this baby bunny's mom is always sort of following him around and just there. And that's kind of how I felt about God. It was just like, God was always just there and wouldn't leave it alone. So when I was 22, right, as I was getting ready to graduate from college, I went back to my hometown where my same pastor was still there, thank goodness, so he like knew all my history already. And I started going into him with all these documents. I went into him with like the small catechism and with the ELCA statement on sexuality and like all these different things, and I was like, explain to me how I can be part of this church that doesn't think that I as an LGBT person should be here. And he did a really good job. I think he did as best as he knew how. He did a lot of reading for me, which I'm grateful for. But he didn't have necessarily the answers that I was looking for, because I was looking for that sort of one right answer. So I decided to go to seminary after I graduated from college, because I thought surely the people in seminary, they will have all the answers. And if you've ever been to seminary, you know that's not how that works. Seminary doesn't have the answers. It teaches you to ask better questions, and it rips you all to shreds, and you have to rebuild everything again. That's how seminary works. And so while I was in seminary, I started realizing that there were things about myself that I had sort of shoved into boxes, into closets that I didn't want to think about, because I thought they were going to be too difficult. The main thing that I was dealing with was my gender. Everybody around me was reading me as female, thought that I was female, and that just didn't make sense to me. It didn't line up with who I knew myself to be. And the process of figuring that out was lifelong. There was no light bulb moment for me. There's no, like, if you ask me, when did you know you were transgender? There wasn't a moment for me. But what I did understand is that as I got more language around things like gender, I could name my experience better. So it wasn't that I was like learning about a new thing and went like, I figured it out, or like I've had the moment of revelation. It was just that I learned the language and figured out what words made sense to me. So while I was in seminary, I started coming out as trans, first to a couple of people around me, a couple of my girlfriend, my close friends, and I started asking them to sort of journey with me. One of the most difficult things about coming out, whether you're a lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, trans, no matter what, is you understand something about yourself, or you come to an understanding about yourself, and then you have to somehow share that understanding with other people, and for most other people, it comes as like this out of the blue, they never expected it, they don't know what to do, you know, and for me, I'm the type of person that's like, I want to have a plan in place before I tell anybody else. Like, I want you to know what's going on before, you know, I get going. And so it was really hard, but I kind of figured out that the best thing to do was to let people in on the journey that I was taking so that they could come with me a little bit, so it wasn't such a shock, such a surprise to them. And I was able to do that with some of my close friends, and like people that were really close to me. I wasn't able to do it so much with my family. That just felt like too big a thing to figure out how to do. So I waited to talk to them until later. But as I figured it out and started gaining the language, I finally was like, this is what it is. This is this strange feeling I've had my whole life, is that my gender is not the same as the sex that was assigned to me when I was born. And we're going to talk a little bit about that language in a minute. Once I figured that out, it was just a matter of time before I was going to have to like let people know, because there's only so long that you can sort of just keep something to yourself when it's about how you exist in the world, when it's about your identity. So finally, I graduated seminary. They handed me my diploma that had my old name on it, and as soon as they did that, I came out to everybody because I was like, I just gotta wait till I get my diploma. They may have given me my diploma anyways, but there was just enough doubt in my mind that I was like, I'm gonna wait until I graduate and then come out. And so I did. And ever since then, I've been trying to figure out how to understand my faith and my gender identity together. Because for a lot of, I'll speak specifically for trans folks, is one of the problems we have is this sense that we have to either choose our faith or our identity and like who we are. Like you get to choose one thing or the other, you don't get to have both. And I always say that's like asking somebody to choose whether they want to chop off an arm or a leg. It's not good either way. You're still chopping off a part of yourself. It's easier in some ways for people to let go of the like church, religion, faith, community part of it than it is to lose your identity. But that there's, for most of the trans folks I know that have had to make that choice and have chosen to leave their faith community, there's always that sense of like, I'm missing something. And that doesn't really go away. And so like the sort of course that needs to be charted then is how do we understand, how do communities understand how to enfold folks who are LGBT and not ask them to make that choice. So that's what I've been doing ever since, is this kind of work about looking at biblical passages. I talk about looking at the clobber passages. That's the passages that are used against LGBT folks. There are really only 2 to 3 passages in the Bible that have much to say about gender identity or trans people today directly. And we can talk about those more if you would like to, but I'm going to move us a little bit beyond that in this particular talk. Because there are people in the Bible whose gender identities are outside the bounds of the norm of that time. And I think it's much more interesting, once we've sort of dispensed with the clobber passages, to talk about the diversity that we see in Scripture. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So what we're going to do here for the rest of our time is we're going to start talking a lot about language and what gender identity means. And I'm starting out here. I know if some of you have maybe heard this already, you might be like, oh, this is old news. But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with language before we get going. Because if I'm saying words up here and you're like, I don't even know what you're talking about, that's not a good place to start. So again, like I said before, if you need to move up to see small print, definitely do that. So, what are all of these letters? Because we have a lot of letters in the LGBT community. This one here at the top is actually one of the more recent sort of configurations that we put together. So I'm going to tell you what these mean, and we're going to talk about them a little bit. That top one there, LGBTQQIP2SA. So that is lesbian, gay, bisexual. We've kind of got a handle on those 3 for most of us, right? Transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, pansexual, two-spirit, and asexual. So that's what those mean, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we understand each of those terms. The first distinction that we have to make is between sexual orientation and gender identity. A lot of times when I talk to parents who have LGBT kids, especially if they have trans kids, they're like, is transgender just like gay 2.0? Like, is this just like a natural evolution? I'm like, no, these are 2 different things. So sexual orientation describes the gender of the people you tend to be attracted to. Gay and lesbian we've pretty much got a handle on. Bisexual is a sort of underrepresented sexuality, and it's a little bit misunderstood. Some folks say that bisexual stands for being attracted to men and women. That's the 2 in bi, right? Bisexual folks, like me, including me, believe that bisexuality means people that share my gender identity and people with a different gender identity. So that's the 2. So that doesn't assume that all people on Earth are either male or female. And we'll get into that. Your sexual behavior describes the way your sexual orientation is played out. So sexual orientation is internal, sexual behavior external. Sexual behavior includes monogamy. Polygamy is sometimes, it's kind of like the action, what's like the verb version kind of, or somebody who is attracted to multiple people at the same time or in relationships with multiple people at the same time would identify as polyamorous usually. But polygamous is kind of like, it's a little bit of an archaic word, and it's a little bit tricky, so you want to be careful with that one. And then celibacy, obviously. Gender identity describes your sense of your own gender. So this has nothing to do with who you're attracted to or who anybody else is. It's just what's internal to you. It has to do with your internal self-perception and experiences. You might be male, you might be female, you might be non-binary, you might be agender. These are all gender identities. You make your gender visible to others through gender expression. So just like with sexual orientation, internal, sexual behavior external, gender identity is internal, gender expression is external. So you could be like, you can kind of combine these. I like to think of these as like ice cream and toppings. You can combine them in a variety of different ways. So if you're like me, you might be a bisexual person whose sexual behavior is monogamy, because I have a girlfriend and she would be unhappy if it was any other way. My gender identity is male, and my gender expression is generally pretty masculine. So that's how I would line up on that. Everybody lines up on this scale in sort of a different way.
Can you just mention asexual real quick?
Yes, right, so asexual...
Yeah, it's skipped a lot.
Yeah, it's true. Asexual, I get to it ahead of myself because I want to get to the gender identity part. Asexual people are people who don't experience sexual attraction to others or experience it in different ways, like on a scale of, like if you think of a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of like the strength of your sexual attraction to somebody, they might be more towards like the 1 or the 2. Sexuality might be sometimes different from romantic orientation. So you might be an asexual person who's not interested in sex, but you might be romantically interested in somebody. You might have romantic feelings toward them, but not want to have sex with them. So that's kind of the difference there. Asexuality for a long time was considered a defect, especially in women. If you weren't interested in sex, they were like, something's wrong with you, and let's put you through some shock therapy, and it was not great. Turns out some people just aren't sexually attracted to other people, and that's totally okay. So, let's talk about gender identity and sex. All people have an assigned sex. So the minute you're born, the doctor takes a look at one tiny piece of your anatomy, and that's what decides whether you're male or female. The problem is that our external reproductive organs are not the only part of sex and gender. We have like full-on bodies that have hormone systems, we've got internal reproductive systems, we've got different chemicals going on in our brains and different connections going on in our brains. So like saying that, like sometimes people will say like, well, your gender is just sort of all in your head, right? But that's a little bit like saying like depression or anxiety is all in your head. Like, yes, it has to do with the way that your brain connects things. That doesn't mean it's not real. So gender identity is different from assigned sex in that your assigned sex is sort of given to you based on one particular part of your anatomy. Your understanding of your own gender happens over time. Developmentally, we know that kids develop their sense of their own gender at 3 sort of general points in their life. Usually between the ages of 1 and 2, because that's the first time you sort of realize that you're a human being. Generally around puberty is the second time, because if your gender identity is different from your assigned sex, you kind of freak out because you're like, I'm going through the wrong puberty, I don't know what to do. So that's kind of the second point. And the third point is in your sort of early 20s, because that's the first point when you're like out in the world as an adult for most of us. And so those tend to be the sort of the 3 developmental points when people go, I think there's something going on with my gender. Now, if you realize that there's something going on with your gender that's out of the ordinary, in a time that is not one of those 3 times, that's okay. It's just that sort of the bell curves, the majority of people figure it out in those 3 times, but you don't have to have figured it out then. Some people are intersex when they're born, which means that the doctors take a look at that one particular part of their reproductive anatomy and go, we don't know what this person is. A relatively large percentage, when you think about it, of people are born intersex. Historically, what the medical system has done is taken those kids and tried to make them fit into a male or female box by doing surgery on them, usually as babies. The Intersex Society of North America is doing a really good job now of trying to get doctors, hospitals, parents educated about this kind of thing so that kids can make decisions about their own bodies when they get older and can actually make decisions for themselves. Right now over at MSU, Pigeon, who is a intersex activist, has a great YouTube channel. They're doing presentations over there this weekend as well. And so if you're interested in intersex stuff and you just Google Pigeon intersex, they're amazing. They can tell you all about their experiences. And then of course some people are transgender, meaning they have sex characteristics that don't always match their gender identity. So you'll notice that there are actually more, the population of intersex people is actually greater than the population of transgender people. It's just that generally we have not talked about intersex people because doctors kind of go, oh, it's better to just make them fit a box at birth so that they don't have problems later. Turns out intersex people do have problems later if they're operated on without their consent. So keep that in mind in terms of the population numbers. So here is a really oversimplified version of what this looks like. Your gender identity is who you know yourself to be, and because we think about things in our heads, that's why I've got that pointing there, even though it's got to do with the whole body, right? Your assigned sex tends to be just one part of your anatomy that people look at, and then that determines forever what kind of clothes you wear and what kind of things you get to do, and it's kind of a bad system, y'all. Sexual and romantic orientation has to do with who you're attracted to, and then your gender expression is how you show all this to other people. So here are all of those words in a couple of Venn diagrams here, because some of them are sexual orientation words, some are gender identity words, and then some are kind of in the middle. So sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, asexual. Just a word on the differences between pansexual and bisexual. Historically, and now today, there's sort of a big Venn diagram crossing of those two communities. Some people prefer bisexual, some people prefer pansexual. Neither word is better. They both mean that you are attracted to people of different gender identities, like a range of different gender identities. The only, some people make the distinction that if you're bisexual, you are attracted to people and include their gender identity as something that you are attracted to, versus if you're pansexual, you are attracted to people regardless of their gender identity. So that's one way of understanding the difference, but they're very closely linked. Transgender and intersex are words that have to do with your gender and your assigned sex. And then queer, questioning, and two-spirit are words that can be in either sort of box. Questioning, obviously, people that are trying to figure out their gender identity or their sexual orientation, that's what that is. Two-spirit is a word that is specifically used within Native American and First Nations communities. And so if you are not Native American or First Nations, you don't use that for yourself, because that is their word that has to do with their cultural understanding of sex and gender that is very different from ours in the sort of white Western world. And then queer, that's a word that people are like real nervous about for understandable reasons because it's been a slur in the past. The reason that people are using it now is mostly because we wanted a word we could use that wasn't a huge long acronym. And so it's being sort of reclaimed as a word to give us an umbrella identity that can cover a range of different identities, and can also, queer is also interesting because it can be a word that pushes back against binaries, meaning things that are separated into two. It pushes back against that and speaks into the space of things being a little bit more gray area than we might otherwise think. So queer can be a great word. The rule of thumb with the word queer is you can use it if somebody else uses it for themselves, or you could use it for yourself, but don't use it for somebody else if you don't know that they use it. That's sort of like the rule of thumb for that, because you don't want to risk saying it to somebody who maybe had it used against them as a kid and bring up those kind of memories. So if somebody uses it for themselves, go ahead and use it, but if you don't know that they use it, don't. All right, so are there people with different sexualities in the Bible? Well, a word before we talk about this. We don't want to be anachronistic, meaning we don't want to put our words on people that lived thousands of years ago in a different place because they didn't have these words. But we can compare experiences. So, like, if certain people are marginalized in this time and certain people are marginalized in this time for similar reasons, we can draw some lines and ties in between them. But this is not me saying, like, look, those are gay people in the Bible, because they didn't think about orientation in the same way. So, David and Jonathan are, of course, probably the most famous pair that people look to in the Bible when we talk about diverse sexualities. David and Jonathan, we see a lot of them in 1 Samuel and a little bit in 2 Samuel as well. David was, of course, King Saul's son, Jonathan was King Saul's son. David was going to be the next king of Israel. And they have this relationship that is like very, sort of very loving in Scripture, both in the way that you sort of read it plainly in English and in the way that you read it in Hebrew. So for instance, we've got this bit from 1 Samuel 18. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And then in 2 Samuel, there's a sort of an elegy that David writes after Jonathan's been killed in battle. And David writes this song in which he says, I mourn for you, my brother Jonathan. Your love was great to me, greater than the love of women. So when you get something like that come through, it's hard to say, no, that's not like them having some sort of love for each other. And like, again, putting the, like labels or words on that is difficult, but there is some sort of different relationship going on there than we see between other men in the Bible. Another story that people look to is the story of Ruth and Naomi in the book of Ruth. And this one is interesting because throughout the book of Ruth, there are all of these family dynamics going on. And so there are some scholars that look at Ruth, and they look at this bit from Ruth specifically, and they say, you know what, we know that this is what love looks like because we use it in marriage ceremonies. Like, we know that this has to do with love, and how we define that love, we might do that in a multitude of different ways. So Ruth says, do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me. That's a old phrase for if anything else happens, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. So one of my favorite scholars says, you know that this is a sort of love declaration because Ruth isn't content with just till death do us part. Ruth goes beyond that and is like, no, not just till death, like beyond death, I will be with you. And so some folks read this in queer theology and say maybe Ruth was bisexual or pansexual because she had relationships, we know, with Boaz later on. And we don't know exactly what was going on between Ruth and Naomi, but we have these intense declarations of love. And throughout the book of Ruth, everything Ruth does is to provide for Naomi. So again, we don't want to put labels on this, but it's interesting to look at the possibilities here. So in terms of gender identities, there are sort of there's one group of people I'm going to talk about and then one individual story. The first group of people I want to talk about is the eunuchs. The eunuchs in Scripture are people who were castrated, so usually people who were assigned male at birth who were castrated, and that may have been for multiple different reasons. Usually it was used as a form of punishment, but some people would choose castration because it allowed them to work in places they couldn't otherwise work, because eunuchs were seen as non-threatening to sort of, well, a lot of things, but they couldn't have kids. So eunuchs would work in king's harems and places that were women-only spaces. Eunuchs were able to move between male and female spaces very easily. Depending on where you're reading in Scripture, eunuchs are either seen as the most trustworthy people ever because they in the fight for passing things on to their own children, or they're seen as devious and sneaky because nobody can figure out what's going on with their gender. Everybody's just like, these people, they're outside the box, we don't know what to do with them. So eunuchs are interesting. They show up first in Deuteronomy 23:1, where we get this verse in Deuteronomy that says, nobody in the company of Israel should be castrated. If you're castrated, you can't be part of the community of Israel anymore, which was a fine and good rule as far as it went. The problem was that when the Israelites were taken into captivity in Babylon, several hundred years later, a bunch of people were castrated because it was very common in Babylon and Persia for the reasons I named earlier. And so a bunch of the Israelites were castrated. They get back to Israel, again, 40, 80 odd years later, and they start to rebuild, and suddenly they go, oh no, we don't know what to do. We have all these people in our community that aren't supposed to be here. And in Isaiah 56, we get this chapter from the prophet Isaiah, who's writing at the time of the sort of rebuilding, about that time. And Isaiah gets a word from God that says the eunuchs should now be included in the community. They are now going to be considered just as good as every other Israelite. They can be in the community. They're going to have a special blessing from God. The problem was there was a group of people at the same time who were very much against that idea of including anybody, if you were a eunuch, if you were a foreigner, basically anybody not a born Israelite who had like the perfect credentials, you were not allowed. And they were the ones that won the argument. So, when we get to the book of Acts, which is in the New Testament, this law that has been like on the books for a long time, that eunuchs aren't allowed in the temple to worship. We know that that's what's going on. But this eunuch from Ethiopia goes to Jerusalem to worship, and you can kind of imagine that he gets there and he's turned away because he's not allowed in. The Apostle Philip meets him leaving Jerusalem and going back home. And they start reading the book of Isaiah together. God has sent Philip specifically to this road to talk to this specific person. And they start reading the book of Isaiah, and they start reading like just a little bit before that bit from Isaiah that I mentioned about inclusion, so you can kind of imagine they're like just about to get there. And as they're reading, the eunuch says, is there anything to keep me from being baptized into this faith of following Jesus? Like, I know I can't pray at the temple, but is there anything in your community that says I can't belong? And Philip doesn't even answer him. He just baptizes him, like, immediately. So Philip and the eunuch went down in the water, and Philip baptized him. And a couple of things that are interesting about this story in Acts that are sort of like literary nuggets of interesting wisdom. One is that this whole meeting between Philip and the eunuch in Acts takes place in the wilderness, in a middle space. Places that the community of Israel has historically had these like transformative experiences. And the Ethiopian eunuch, all of his identities are weird middle space identities. He's a eunuch, so he's kind of in the middle of like gender and assigned sex. He is Ethiopian, so he is not of the people of Israel. So he's like different in terms of race and ethnicity. He is a slave, but he is the slave of the queen of Ethiopia, so he's like in this weird economic space. Everything about this eunuch is weird middle identities. And so he asks Philip, is anything going to prevent me? Are any of my identities going to prevent me from being part of this community? And Philip says no. So that's where we see things going on in Acts. In Luke, we see the story of the man carrying the jar of water. Now this is Jesus and his disciples. They're getting ready to spend Passover together, and they want to know where to go. Jesus sends Peter and John saying, go and prepare the Passover meal for us that we may eat it. And they asked him, where do you want us to make preparations for it? Listen, he said to them, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house he enters, and say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs already furnished. Make preparations for us there. Now, nothing seems too out of the ordinary about this verse, except if you knew that in Jesus' time, only women carried water. Like ever. Like men didn't carry water, it was women's work, it was seen as demeaning, of course, because that's how the patriarchy works. And like, it would have been incredibly strange to see a man carrying a jar of water. Even if there was no other person in the house to do that work, they would have had that work hired out to a woman in the community. So this was very unusual. And the fact that Jesus specifically says, go to the house of the person who's expressing their gender in an unconventional way, is an interesting point for us to consider. So again, we don't want to put any words on this person that they wouldn't have chosen for themselves, but recognizing that their expression of their gender is out of the ordinary, and that Jesus specifically asks for that house to stay in, might mean something for us. So, a couple of end notes on this scripture bit here. The first is that we've got this great text in Galatians 3, and a lot of us know this one, of course. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. This was actually my memory verse when I did decide to get baptized when I was 22. I was like, this is the one that says gender doesn't matter. And as I have learned more about it, though, I have come to the conclusion that it's not saying that gender doesn't matter. What I and other scholars think it's saying is that gender doesn't get in the way of God's love for us or our ability to be in a relationship. It doesn't mean that all of these identities don't matter at all, because we do know that things like, ethnicity, ability, race, like we have all of these parts of our identity that are important to us, and we don't want anybody just sort of whitewashing them away and saying like, oh, I love you, despite all of that or whatever. That's not what real love looks like. In this text, what we're seeing is a inclusion to community and an inclusion in the love of God that is not dependent on any of these kinds of identity. So that doesn't mean that we should go around saying, your identity doesn't matter because Galatians. Rather, we should be saying, like, your identity does matter, but it's not going to keep you from God, nor should it keep you from community. Another bit that I like to pull out is 1 Corinthians. Just as the body is one that has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. And the reason that I like to pull this out is because I think it's really relevant to LGBTQ people in Christian spaces. Nobody else gets to say to you, we don't need you, you're not relevant, you don't need to be part of this community. Because in being part of this community in Christ and with God, like, you are an important part of that community, and nobody else can tell you otherwise. I mean, they can say it, but it doesn't make it true. So when we think about the community as a body, how might that change the way that we think about bodies in general? And for me, this is something that I'm thinking a lot about in terms of trans folks, and especially if you choose to get gender-confirming surgery, which can be a lot of different things. There are lots of different kinds of gender-confirming surgery. What might that say about, like, our own relationship to our bodies? So there's a lot to think about here, but the takeaway point I want to get from that verse is nobody gets to tell you that you're not allowed to be here. You are allowed to be here. So let's talk about why allyship to LGBTQ folks is important. And again, this is the really small text, so I'll try to read some of it out loud without just reading off my slides. So the important parts here is that we know that the suicide rates for LGBTQ folks are disproportionately high. Specifically among transgender folks, the suicide rate is 41%, which is like almost half of trans people attempt suicide, which is incredible. Here's the hopeful part about this, and I guess it's a glass half empty, half full thing, but LGBT people who experience family rejection are more likely to attempt suicide, and the thing that determines family rejection is whether or not that family is involved in an affirming faith community. So, like, if we can make an affirming faith community, that makes an affirming family, which makes the kid feel affirmed, which lowers their risk for suicide. So all of this lines exactly up, which is why this is so important. The other thing to note is that so far in 2018, 21 transgender people have been murdered, and they are almost all transgender women of color, specifically Black transgender women. Last year was the deadliest year for transgender people, with 29 transgender people killed, and we are looking to at least match that, if not beat it, this year. And so when we talk about the health and safety of transgender people, we have to remember that transgender people of color, transgender women of color, are at most risk. Now, sometimes when I talk about the suicide rate, people are like, something must be wrong with these kids. Like, if they're considering suicide, something must be wrong with them. Is this a mental health issue? What do we do? There is a mental health issue, but the problem is not the fact that they're trans. The problem is that they experience this thing called minority stress. Now, minority stress is something experienced by anybody that is outside of the straight, white, male experience. And so if you are somebody who is outside of that experience in any way, you might experience a certain amount of minority stress. The people then that experience the most minority stress in this context are Black transgender women, because they fall outside of, like, all of those sort of normative parts of our culture. This sense of feeling like you are just constantly waiting for rejection takes a real toll on your mental health. When you're just sort of expecting, like, the minute people find out who you are, you're going to get rejected. Like that, it's no wonder that you deal with things like anxiety and depression when you have to deal with minority stress. So that's the background on what's going on here. Oh, and again, like, the thing we know about minority stress is that the more people are supported in their identities, the better off they are and the less negative effects they feel of minority stress. So again, we've got that lineup of, like, affirming community, affirming family, affirming self. Second, allyship is important because our youth need our support and our knowledge. This is a study that I pull out all the time because I think it's fascinating. When asked about whether their church was accepting, 8% said their church was very accepting, 22% said their church was not at all accepting, and 53% straight up didn't know because their church never talks about it. That's a problem, because when you are somebody who are of any sort of minority, but if you're specifically in this case an LGBT youth, and nobody in your church talks about these issues, you have to assume that you are not welcome and they won't accept you for your own safety. Like, you have to keep yourself safe. If you assume that once you come out, bad things will happen, you don't tell anybody. And so one of the things that we have to do better about in our churches is talking about these issues, and they don't have to be a big, a big thing like even like this. Like, it can just be like, today at coffee hour, we're talking about this news story about, somebody who is trans or somebody who is gay or whatever. And like, just bringing it up as a source of conversation in a positive way is going to open those doors for a better conversation later. And then 3, allyship is important because LGBT folks are already a part of our church communities, and you probably already know this, but 48% of LGBT Americans identify as Christian. And in the 2015 trans survey, 66% of trans folks, now this is a little bit hard to follow, 66% of trans folks said they had been involved with a church at some point in their life. 39% of those people left the church, but almost half of that 39% found a new church. So we've got sort of like diminishing returns there, but like, they're finding new churches. And that's, again, the sort of glass half full takeaway there. So not only do we want to be churches that can welcome people when they walk in our doors, but we also have to be churches that welcome people when they come out in our community. And the best way to make sure it is safe for people to come out is to have these conversations. And then 4, of course, we're called to allyship because we're supposed to. We're Christians. We've got all these verses about helping people who need help. So we got those. So what is allyship? What are we actually talking about here when we talk about being allies? I like to use the phrase practicing allyship as a verb because it really puts the sort of onus on us to be doing things. When we talk about like being an ally as a sort of static noun, it's easier to just be like, yeah, I'm an ally, and not ever do anything to back that up. So talking about practicing allyship is maybe a better way to talk about it because it gets us moving. So, allyship, a lifelong commitment to relationships, conversation, learning, accountability, and action. Those are sort of the main tenets of allyship. So an ally is a member of a group in power who rejects that power in order to act in solidarity with the oppressed. That's your dictionary definition there. And we actually have a really good model for this, surprisingly enough. We got Jesus. Jesus, this is from Philippians 2, this is the Christ hymn. It's possibly the oldest portion of the New Testament. And it tells us about who Jesus was and what Jesus did. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. So this idea of like having all the power of the universe and choosing to become human, to experience humanity with us, alongside us, that's what allyship looks like. And we're called to do that on like a much smaller scale, but still, that's what we're looking for here, is taking the power that we once had, letting go of that, giving that to somebody who needs it in order to be alongside them on their journey. So just some quick do's and don'ts about what you should and shouldn't do as an ally. Allies don't act out of guilt. So like a lot of times, and we all do this. This is not like calling people out. This is like a thing that we all do. But sometimes we're just like, oh, I feel super bad about whatever identity it is that I have that gives me power. Like for instance, I now look like, because I have a girlfriend, I look like a straight, white, cisgender guy most of the time. People don't know if I don't tell them that I'm trans or that I'm bisexual. So I suddenly have a bunch of social power that I never had before, and sometimes I feel really weird and guilty about that. Instead of feeling guilty about it, we can find ways to vocalize our identities and to give the microphone to people who need it. One of the things in the ELCA, we have this weird thing that I don't like where we talk about being the voice for the voiceless. Nobody is voiceless. You just have to pass them the mic. So that's what allyship looks like. Don't constantly expect gratitude because you're just being a good human being, and that shouldn't require extra cookies. Don't speak over people. Don't get defensive when you're wrong. If you're wrong about something, or you call somebody the wrong name or whatever, they're most likely going to be forgiving of that because you're learning. Like, allow yourself the space to learn and do something differently next time. But allies do educate themselves all the time, and that doesn't necessarily mean going to your local gay person and being like, tell me about your life. It's more like reading and watching movies, and although movies are iffy, learning more from other people who are intentionally trying to educate you. Explaining issues to other people, so if you have somebody who you talk to all the time who like says a negative thing about bisexual folks, you can be like, actually, that's a myth that bisexual people date like 80 people at once. Turns out they just like people of different genders. Redirecting the spotlight and interrupting negative behavior. We're going to talk about that in a little bit here. So this is just sort of a little list, again, it's very small print, I'm sorry, about identifying possible privileges that you may have if you are cisgender or if you're straight. So you don't have to come out. Most people on TV share your identity. It's like a big deal when there's an LGBT person on TV. You don't have to worry about which bathroom you use or whether you're going to get beat up if you go into it. You don't have to think about holding hands with your partner in public and whether you're going to get beat up for walking down the street. Most importantly, you have the opportunity to learn about different kinds of privileges that you have rather than experiencing oppression firsthand for whatever that opposite of that privilege might be. So what do we do with this thing that we have? You can give it to other people by giving up your time and space. So one of the things that I try to do while I'm like going around speaking and stuff is if they are asking me to speak about something like, I had people a couple times be like, will you speak about intersex issues? And I'm like, well, no, because I'm not intersex. So I've got to pass the mic to somebody that actually is. So making sure that people can speak for themselves, essentially. Opting out if you realize marginalized people are being excluded. Sometimes that happens, like for instance, if you are in a group of people and you realize that, like again, I'm just giving you experiences from my own life which may or may not be applicable, but sometimes when I get asked to do something and it's like I get there and I find out that all the speakers are white folks and we don't have any people of color on the panel, that's probably not good. You want to find ways to give them resources for people that they could talk to that maybe have different perspectives. People are more likely to listen to you if you share their identity. So if you are also a woman, or if you are also straight, or if you are also, fill in the blank, you are more likely to be able to get, to be able to speak with somebody and have them believe you, which is kind of weird, especially if you're speaking about an experience that you've never had. But people will listen to you because you share that thing in common. So find the people that you share things in common with, and then sneakily be like, here's some information you didn't have before. And then, yeah, remember, no voiceless people. So, here's some action steps for individuals. Keep educating yourself. Start using inclusive language, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Practice interrupting negative conversation. Again, talk about that in a minute. Be vocal about your support, so people know kind of where you stand on things so that they can come out to you if they want to. Get involved in policy change. There's policies happening all the time. Right after marriage equality happened, suddenly we had an influx of all of these trans-negative bathroom bills and all kinds of stuff because LGBT organizations were like, we got marriage, we're done. You're not done. We got so much else to do. So keep an eye out for different policy things going on in your state and nationwide. Offering to help people navigate possibly unsafe spaces. Sometimes when I go out to the bar with my friends, I will have one of my guy friends go check out the bathroom first, make sure it's safe, make sure there is a stall or a door on the stall sometimes. Guys' bathrooms are gross. So having people navigate those spaces with you is good. And then donate to organizations headed by LGBTQ+ people, because they know what's going on most of the time. So let's practice our language a little bit. This is going to be the interactive portion, so get ready, introverts. You're just going to practice with the people next to you, so don't worry too much. We're going to talk about pronouns. So among trans folks, you sometimes have people who identify as binary trans folks, meaning that they go from being assigned female to identifying as male, like me, or you have somebody who's assigned female and identifies, hold on, I did that wrong. See, I get confused sometimes. Assigned female, identify as male, like me, or assigned male and identify as female. So that's like so that would be a binary trans person that kind of goes from one thing to the other. But not everybody does. Some people are non-binary or gender non-conforming. There are all different kinds to have a gender that is outside of just male and female. So for people who are trans or gender non-conforming, sometimes they don't want to use pronouns like he, him, and his, or she, her, and hers, because it doesn't accurately reflect who they really are. One of the reasons that pronouns are important, this is kind of the way that I have explained it to people in my life, is that if you use the wrong name or pronouns for somebody, it's essentially saying that you don't actually see them. For me, when people use a wrong name or pronoun for me, it feels a little bit like they're talking to a cardboard cutout in front of me, like that's who they're talking to, and I have to be like, no, I'm over here. So when you use somebody's correct name and pronouns, it really means that you're seeing them and you're interacting with them as like a human being. So here are some possible pronouns. Hopefully we can see it all right. But so the ones we're most familiar with, of course, are she, her, and hers, and he, him, and his. But we also have the gender-neutral they, them, and theirs, used for a singular person. Sometimes I have English teachers come up to me and be like, that's not how grammar works. And I have to say, well, Shakespeare actually used singular they quite a few times, and so did Chaucer. So we've got precedent. So they, them, and theirs can be used as a singular pronoun, and it's sort of gender neutral, which is great. Lots of other languages have gender neutral pronouns. English just doesn't happen to have them, so we sort of make them there. And then we've got other pronouns like Z and here, which are sort of combinations of he and him and she and hers. And some people will use those as well. So the best way to work with pronouns is to practice using them. Because the problem is that our brains have specific neural pathways, and the more you go over that neural pathway, the more solid that pathway becomes. So in order to create a new pathway, you have to do it over and over and over. So that's why most trans folks are not going to be mad at you for getting their pronouns wrong a couple times, because your brain is still adjusting. It's the kind of thing where you're still doing it wrong after like a year and a half or 2 years, so that's where things start to get a little bit hairy. But generally, this just requires practice. So we're going to practice a little bit. So we've got a couple of situations here, and I want you to turn to your neighbor or somebody you know or somebody you don't know and you'd like to know, and practice saying these sentences with different pronouns. So we've got these different kinds of pronouns down here. She, her, hers, herself, he, him, his, himself, they, them, theirs, themself, and Z, here, here's, herself. That's how you pronounce things. So I want you to turn to your neighbor and try a couple of these out. And go.
Sean wants birds. Their favorite is to I would go to the dance of Spain. Z is so cool. Or Z is so cool. It's almost cliche.
All right, everybody. Let's bring it on back. Before we go on, does anybody have any thoughts about how that felt to say different pronouns they're not used to? Did it feel weird?
Felt weird.
Felt weird?
Would you pronounce the bottom line for me?
Sure. It's Z, here, here's, hereself.
Here.
Yeah, like H-E-R-E, kind of same pronunciation.
And that's why I use they instead of the normal pronouns.
See, there you go. Sometimes the singular they. I just always use they unless I know somebody's pronouns, because it's so much easier to just use singular they and not have to worry about saying the wrong thing right away. Because people are super forgiving if you say they and they actually use him, like, versus using him when really the pronouns are her, right? So like it's just easier to go with the they unless you know for sure.
I'm confused.
Yeah.
Because we tend to, in this country anyway, have certain names for boys and certain names for girls. Now, if I identified as male, but I still went by Betsy, of course, people would use the, unless they knew. Now, I would automatically use the male pronouns for you, because you look like a man.
The problem with assuming somebody's pronouns based on your name or on your gender presentation is that it makes it more difficult for people that are like just coming out, or for people that are like the people that don't look the way we think they should look. So like nobody is going to argue, for instance, that like if you're a woman you must wear a dress at all times so we can identify you, right? Like nobody's going to make that argument. So we also, in the same way, sort of don't want to say you have to wear a dress so that I know to use she pronouns for you, right? Like that doesn't quite line up. So the point being that it's easier to err on the side of gender neutrality unless you know. So that's kind of where it's coming from, is that like it's easier to change from neutral to something different than it is to assume something over here and in reality it's way over here. It's easier to move from the middle. Does that make a little bit of sense?
No.
Fair. That's fair. If you want to talk about it more though, I'd definitely be willing to do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about avoiding questions you shouldn't ask, because there are some questions that are super intrusive that you just want to stay away from. The reason I'm giving you this stuff about language and intrusive questions is because I don't want you to be afraid to talk to trans folks because you're like, I'm going to say the wrong thing. So this is just like your general overview so that you can feel a little bit more comfortable talking about it.
Are you talking as to people who know that you're trans?
In general?
Yeah, because you look like a man to me, so.
Right? Yeah, so in general, most people assume that I'm assigned male at birth unless I tell them that I'm trans. But the problem is that if I allow everybody to assume I am only having one kind of experience throughout my whole life, they don't fully understand who I am or what experiences I've had. So for instance, if I say like, oh, back when I was part of the Girl Scouts, people are gonna be like, what? You know? And so like, you have to kind of explain that. And so I don't always explain it. Sometimes I just let people think what they want to think, because I look the way that I feel like I should look, and they can think whatever they want. But the problem comes in when things don't line up with people's expectations, and then sometimes people get really angry about that. And that's when it gets hard. When people are like, I'm mad because you have tricked me somehow. And it's like, I never tricked you. This is exactly who I am. But you assumed things about me. And we know what assuming does. So, so here's some things to think about. Always think before asking. Would I be comfortable answering this if somebody was asking me? So if you're asking somebody about their genitalia, maybe think about that one again. Is this about somebody's body or sexual activity that is private to them? And does this question make light of somebody's identity? So does it assume that like somebody's identity is a funny thing or is not really that important, it's just sort of a toss away thing? So think about that before you ask a question. Some things to not ask people. Which one of you is the guy in the relationship? My friend who is getting ready to marry her wife next week says that's like asking, is the fork or the spoon the chopstick? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Have you had the surgery yet? There is no the surgery. There are many different kinds of gender confirmation surgery, and not every trans person gets them. It's totally dependent on your own thing and what you want to do with your body. So yeah, a lot of times when people ask, have you had the surgery, they mean, have you had what we would consider like lower surgery or something to do with your reproductive genitals, like external genitals. And like, it's nobody's business. It's nobody's business. When are you going to come out, or have you come out already? Anything to pressure somebody to come out. Don't do that. We have a lot to lose if we come out a lot of the time. Are you sure you're not really X? Let people figure stuff out at their own rate. Sometimes it can be helpful to introduce people to new words or ask them if they've heard about this thing or that thing, but don't be like, I know my identity, or I know your identity better than you do. What's your real name? Don't ask people what their real name is, because for a couple different reasons. Number one, you might accidentally out somebody in an unsafe situation. I remember when I was first coming out and my mom said, I can't quite call you Austen yet, but I recognize that like if we go out to dinner or something, I'm gonna just like really think about it and make sure that I do it because it can be dangerous if I don't. So like recognize that names can be a problem and can be dangerous. Second of all, lots of trans folks have had their birth name used against them by family members who are not supportive and are trying to make a point about it. Lots of my family members, extended family members, still call me by my birth name specifically because they want to make a point about how they don't accept me. And like, that can be really traumatizing for people. So we want to not use somebody's birth name or ask what their birth name is. Sometimes people will volunteer that information, but we never want to make a point of asking them about it because that might be a private thing for them. And then do you think it might be a phase? Even if it is a phase, we should always appreciate and respect a person where they are. So like, maybe it is a phase. And lots of parents worry about like their little kids who are just coming out and trying to understand their gender, and it's like, well, you're too young to know about your gender. But then we have people who are coming out in their 50s, and then it's like, well, you're too old to know about your gender. You should have known before. Like, we don't have a good place where people should know about their gender. With little kids, there's a lot I could say about that, but the bottom line of it is, standard guidelines say if a little kid is insistent, persistent, and consistent about their gender, it's probably because they're actually trans. And it may be that they're just playing around with gender roles and gender expression, and that's totally fine too. But the more we make an open world for them to be able to express themselves in that way, the better a world they'll be able to grow up in later if they are trans. And if they aren't, hey, more people got to wear dresses, that's great.
Could I ask a question? I was gonna ask it later privately.
Go ahead.
That I always knew I was a girl,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't like to do girly things.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to climb trees and ride my bike and do all of those sorts of things.
Sure.
In today's world, would it be assumed that I was trans?
No, I think we've gotten to a point, especially, like, it's a lot easier for girls to do boy things than for boys to do girl things because the patriarchy. I think with that kind of thing, we've made enough of a recognition of a difference between like gender roles, gender expression that are changeable versus like somebody's actual sense of their gender, which seems to be pretty solid for most folks. I think we've made enough of a distinction there that it's fine.
Today, if you had somebody like me.
Right, yeah.
That nobody would be assuming that I was.
No. No, usually for people who are assigned male but come out as female when they're little, if they're little and they're trans girls, usually people get that right away because they do girly things and people are on the lookout for that because it's not okay. For trans boys, for people that are assigned female at birth, parents usually don't know until the kid is like, I'm a boy. Like they literally say the words, I'm a boy, and that's when parents are just like, oh. Because it takes a lot more for people to say that's not okay for a girl to do nowadays than it used to. All right, so got a couple more slides here. Interrupting negative conversations. If you see negative conversations going on, here's a way to get in the middle. And this is, if you're like me from up in Minnesota and you are like averse to conflict, this might be difficult. But here's one of the things that I do most of the time. Ask the person to explain what they meant by what they said. So like this works a lot for jokes, because if somebody tells a really terrible joke about somebody and you ask them why it's funny, they then have to explain why they're a terrible person for saying that joke. So like, ask them why it's funny and they will explain it to you, and then you'll be like, that's not funny though. Like, do you hear yourself? So asking people to talk out what they just said can sometimes be helpful. If the comment was thoughtless, just explain the impact of what they actually said, because lots of people don't realize the impact. Like for instance, I have lots of people that are like, I don't know why names and pronouns are important. And then once I explain why they're important, they're like, oh, okay. Like I still don't totally understand, but I at least realize what the effect of my words are, and that can be helpful. If harm is intentional, set clear limits. Explain that you're removing yourself from the situation, or removing, if you're protecting somebody who is LGBT and you need to remove them from the situation. This is especially hard. I work with a lot of families who, like, the parents will maybe support the trans kid, but the grandparents don't. And the parents have to make decisions about like where to draw boundaries with the grandparents, and that's really, really tough. But sometimes that is what has to happen if sort of your child's health and well-being is at risk. So yeah, it's a tough place to be, but sometimes it's what has to happen. Focus on helping others take responsibility for their actions and foster conversation about what to do differently next time. We don't want to, one of the things that we've gotten too used to doing recently, in my personal opinion, is shutting things down when somebody does one thing we don't like. Just like, well, now we're not talking anymore, now you're canceled as a person. But like, if we can find ways to foster continuing that conversation and saying, you did this time, here are the effects of what you just did. I would like it if you did this thing next time, to continue the conversation and continue the relationship in the future by setting expectations. That's a lot better than being like, well, we're never gonna talk again. Because it allows space for people to learn. So, what can you do in faith communities? In faith communities, these are sort of the steps that I go through. Educate yourself, have internal conversation, because lots of times churches think they're all on the same page until they sit down to have a conversation about it and they find out they are not on the same page. Come to a consensus, so that doesn't necessarily mean 100% of people have to be on board, but you should probably try to get like 80% on board and keep having conversations until you get to a consensus. Connect with organizations that are in your denomination or that are interdenominational that can help you find resources, and then follow through. Once you have decided to be LGBT affirming, you actually have to do something about it. And that's, I think, the step where most churches get stuck. But there are lots of great things you can do. So I'm gonna hand out a couple things for you. This first one here, oh thanks. This first one here is, let me take one of these seconds. Actually, I don't really have to say too much about this one, but this one has these steps that I just put up here, the what to do next, and then on the back it's got steps for individuals and steps for churches, communities. And then this is a faith resource list. If you're interested in this stuff and you want to, find online or in print or organizations, resources, anything you want to find out more about, that will be helpful. So Michelle's going to hand those out for us. So I'm not going to go through these guys, but I'm going to do this one bit here at the end. So the last thing I want to talk about is how you actually start these conversations. Because internal conversations can be tough. The first thing you want to do is gather support. So if you've got a couple other people in your congregation that are super on board to try to do something new, get together with them first and try to plan out like the best and worst case scenarios for what you're doing. Like best case scenario, this is the actual thing you want to happen. You want your church to have same-gender weddings in your church, or you want your church to have a LGBT section in your youth group, or whatever. Like this is what you really want to do. The worst case scenario has to be, what happens if we start talking about LGBT inclusion and suddenly people are in danger of being kicked out of the church? So you want to find like a best case, worst case scenario. Check in with LGBT members of your community. They should be the ones leading unless they don't want to lead. They can totally feel free to duck out of that, because putting your life on the chopping block for everybody to discuss is rough. So check in with LGBT members in your community to see if there's anything that they would like to do. Then you can map out some of the hierarchies in your community, and pretty much every community has them, whether it's a pastor or a board or a camp director, whatever it is. Who are the people that get to make decisions? And then how can you educate and petition those people to do whatever it is that you're hoping that they will do? Another thing to keep in mind is, who are the unofficial leaders of this community? Who are the people who are the pillars of the congregation? Who does the most unpaid work? Who holds the community's memories? Who are the oldest people in the community? These are all people that can help create change in your particular community. And then beginning relational advocacy. So relational advocacy essentially means starting with one-on-one conversations in which you don't try to change anybody's ideas or concepts, you're just sharing stories. So you might be the parent of an LGBT person, or you might be the friend of an LGBT person, and you can share your story about what that relationship has meant to you. So relational advocacy is all about telling stories, because if we've learned nothing else from the past couple of years, it's that facts don't matter anymore. So sharing stories is actually one of the best ways to have people expand their compassion and their empathy. And yeah, invite LGBTQ speakers. You're already doing it, congrats. Alright, and then, oops, hold on. Yeah, and then once you have a certain number of the community sort of on board to make a change, you can do that. So it's all about sort of starting small, starting with one-on-one conversations, and moving towards larger groups. And then show some kind of statement that everybody feels like they have come to together. That can be really hard to get consensus on stuff, but having something at the end where you can be like, look, this is what we did, can be a real morale booster. So that's where I'm going to end. There's my contact info, and we've got 10 minutes for questions. So, oh yeah, nice.
What is the name of your book?
Oh, here, let me, yeah, I should probably talk about that, shouldn't I?
Yeah, you probably should.
Oh, there goes the mic. Hold on, there we go. Okay, here's my book. It's got a nice tree on it. I can pass it around if you want to look at it. So essentially this book is that tiny, tiny section I did on gender minorities in scripture. That's what this whole thing is. And it's about, so it interweaves scripture, stories from scripture, with interviews that I've done with people who identify as transgender and Christian. So it's like modern stories and ancient stories and what we do next. So I'll pass this around. So it's called Transforming, the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. Hold on, was that your only question? I think it was. So then you're next. You can pass that around.
It's less of a question, more of a comment.
Go for it. Comment.
So how do you say there are no people who are voiceless? But what about mute people?
A good point. A good point. Yeah, I meant metaphorically voiceless. Like they have ways to express themselves.
Yeah, I do that. I was just holding it in until the comments that there.
Good point. That's a good point. I should say there are no people who are metaphorically voiceless. You're right.
Yes.
Good point.
Big.
Other thoughts, comments, questions?
Did you bring any books?
I didn't bring any books. No, I'm sorry. I should have. I did not realize that should have been a thing. We've been making stuff up as we go along, me and Michelle, so I didn't have that together. But it's available everywhere. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever. You can mail me one. I'll sign you one and mail it to you. Other questions?
Austin can sign some Post-it notes.
Say those again.
Stick it in there.
It is.
The one thing you were talking about, phase, made me think, we all go through phases,
Yeah.
and we need to realize it, and you have gone through many phases, but that's part of establishing your identity then.
Yeah, that's, so for those who didn't hear, they're saying that part of establishing your identity is going through phases, and that's absolutely true. I had a friend of mine who came up to me a while ago, and they said, I had this woman come up to me at church, so my friend's a pastor. They said, one of my congregants came up to me, she's like a 75-year-old woman, and she said, I would like to tell you about every time my hormones changed in my life. When I went through puberty, when I had a baby, when I went through menopause, and how that affected my understanding of myself. Because your hormones change you. And so like even people who are cisgender, who are not doing any kind of hormone therapy, have those kinds of changes going on in their bodies all the time. So yeah, it's not such a strange thing.
Well, and we've all gone through phases in understanding this community.
Yeah, it's true. Other questions?
I might actually add to your election of LGBT in the Bible,
Nice.
Daniel
Yeah.
is probably in a eunuch.
Yeah, Daniel is one of the, I don't know, Daniel's a fascinating book, fascinating character. But yeah, Daniel, there's lots of theories about the fact that Daniel was a eunuch. A couple other people in the Bible that have really interesting stories include Joseph. Joseph's one of my favorite characters, Joseph of Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. The word that is used to describe Joseph's coat is only used one other place in the whole Bible, and it's the word that's used to describe a princess's dress. And so people from like as far back as Jesus' time in Jewish communities have read Joseph as canonically queer. Not only because of the dress, but also because there's that bit where he's in Potiphar's house in Egypt, and Potiphar's wife kind of comes on to him, and Joseph literally runs out the door. And people have read that and been like, something's up with Joseph. So yeah, there are all these biblical characters that have different things going on that we don't get to look at very often. And the reason we don't look at them is because we don't have LGBT people in ministry talking about them. So like, the more LGBT people you get in ministry and in our communities, the more they can see things that people haven't seen before, which is good for all of us.
Or we avoid.
Or we avoid. Good point. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for being here. This was great.